In the 1960s, railroad bosses dismissed General Electric's 83-foot dual-engine U50 as an absurd experiment, too weird to be trusted on America's busiest freight lines. Yet this single giant could outpull 3 standard diesel locomotives, promising savings that threatened to upend an entire industry's economics. Why did the locomotive that frightened its own operators become the answer to skyrocketing costs? And what made it so controversial that only a handful were ever built? The real story starts with a crisis railroads could not ignore. Freight trains in the United States grew longer and heavier throughout the 1960s, stretching the limits of what a single locomotive could handle. Railroads scrambled to keep up. Every new car added to a train meant more weight to pull, more fuel burned, and most painfully, more crew members required by law. The rules were strict. For each locomotive in a consist, union contracts demanded a full crew. That meant an engineer, a fireman, and often multiple brakemen for every engine on the front of a train. On a typical heavy-haul route, a railroad might lash together 3 diesel units just to get a loaded coal train over the mountains. Each one needed its own crew, multiplying wages and benefits with every additional engine. The numbers added up fast. In 1965, a locomotive engineer earned around $4 an hour, with annual pay climbing to nearly $9,000, benefits not included. Multiply that by 3 engines per train, then add firemen and brakemen, and the payroll for a single freight run could easily top $30,000 a year per locomotive. For a railroad running dozens of trains each day, labor costs alone swallowed a staggering share of revenue. Railroad operations planners faced a daily headache. Coordinating multiple crews meant more scheduling conflicts, more room for error, and more time spent just getting trains out of the yard. Every extra crew member increased the risk of delays, disputes, and overtime. On top of that, maintenance shops had to keep 3 separate locomotives in working order for every major freight run. That meant 3 times the inspections, 3 times the repairs, 3 times the downtime. Union Pacific and other major carriers felt the squeeze most on the steepest grades. On Wyoming's Sherman Hill, for example, the only way to move a 100-car coal train was to stack multiple engines up front and sometimes add helpers at the back. Each one came with its own crew, each governed by contracts negotiated decades earlier. Even as diesel technology advanced, these labor rules barely budged. The more horsepower a railroad needed, the more people had to be on the payroll. By the early 1960s, the industry's biggest expense wasn't fuel or track maintenance. It was the people required to keep trains moving. Railroads couldn't just hire fewer workers. Union agreements and federal regulations made that impossible. Instead, they started looking for a way to do more with less. If a single locomotive could deliver the power of 3, and if it could be operated by just 1 crew, the savings would be enormous. The pressure to find such a solution grew with every pay raise and every new mile of track. For railroad executives, the search for a high-horsepower, single-unit answer wasn't just about innovation. It was about survival. The General Electric U50 did not look or sound like anything else on American rails. At more than 83 feet long, it stretched farther than most city buses parked end to end. Veteran engineers, used to the compact proportions of a standard diesel, found themselves staring down a machine that seemed to defy railroad logic. The U50's enormous frame rode on 4 separate 2-axle trucks, arranged in a rare B+B wheel configuration, with each pair of trucks joined by a span bolster. This design, borrowed from the gas turbine era, gave the locomotive a segmented, almost insect-like stance as it crept through the yard. But the real shock came under the hood. Instead of a single engine, the U50 carried 2 16-cylinder FDL prime movers, each delivering 2,500 horsepower. These engines sat back to back, each one powering its own generator and feeding electricity to the traction motors on its half of the locomotive. The dual-engine setup meant that, in theory, the U50 could keep running even if one side failed, a kind of mechanical insurance policy. In practice, though, it doubled the complexity and left crews with twice as many systems to monitor. The cab sat high above the rails, perched in the middle of the frame, offering panoramic views, but also a sense of isolation. Some engineers describe the experience as riding in a control tower on wheels. The controls themselves felt familiar, but the scale of everything else was disorienting. The radiators, instead of being tucked neatly behind the cab, were pushed out to the very ends of the locomotive, giving the U50 a stretched, almost awkward silhouette. Maintenance crews grumbled about the long runs of piping and wiring required to connect systems across such a vast machine. On tight curves, the U50's span bolster trucks struggled to keep all wheels in line. The locomotive's sheer length meant it often overhung the rails, making it a challenge to fit through older yards and roundhouses. Shop workers needed special jacks and tools just to lift an axle or check a traction motor. Even simple inspections took longer, as everything was bigger, heavier, and further apart than on a standard engine. For many railroaders, the U50's radical design felt like a solution from another planet. Instead of three separate locomotives lashed together, here was one giant machine, trying to do the same job with twice the complexity and none of the familiar backup. The promise of 5,000 horsepower in a single unit was tempting, but the day-to-day reality was a locomotive that looked, sounded, and handled like nothing they had ever trusted before. Accountants at Union Pacific started running the numbers as soon as the U50's blueprints hit their desks. They saw a single locomotive with 5,000 horsepower, enough to pull the weight of 3 standard diesel locomotives. That meant, on paper, 2 fewer crews per train. In the 1960s, the math was hard to ignore. Each engineer cost about $9,000 a year, not counting overtime or benefits. And the firemen and brakemen added thousands more. Multiply that by every train running day and night across hundreds of miles, and labor quickly became the largest line item in the ledger. The U50's promise was simple: one big machine, one crew, one payroll. For every consist that swapped 3 locomotives for a single U50, the railroad could cut out 2 full sets of wages, benefits, and pension contributions. Over a 10-year service life, that added up to nearly $200,000 in labor savings per locomotive, money that could be spent on track upgrades, new cars, or simply shoring up the bottom line. The savings did not stop at payroll. Fewer locomotives meant fewer maintenance cycles. Instead of scheduling 3 separate engines for inspections and repairs, the shop could focus on one. That meant less downtime, fewer spare parts in inventory, and less paperwork for the back office. Fuel efficiency improved too, especially on long, heavy hauls where a single U50 could run at optimal throttle instead of juggling the quirks of 3 mismatched units. Even with a higher sticker price, nearly $600,000 per U50 compared to $250,000 for a standard diesel locomotive, the long-term economics tipped in favor of the big machine. Railroads could run the same tonnage with fewer people, fewer engines, and less hassle. The U50's dual-engine setup promised redundancy as well. If one side failed, the train could limp home on half its power, avoiding costly breakdowns in the middle of nowhere. On the spreadsheet, the U50 looked like the answer to every railroad executive's prayers. But numbers alone could not settle the debate. The real test would come on the rails, where theory met the hard realities of grade, weather, and daily wear. Only then would the U50's economic promise be proven or disproven by the grind of actual service. Sherman Hill in Wyoming has always been a proving ground for railroad power. Its 1.5% grade stretches for miles, pulling every last bit of effort from locomotives and crews. In 1965, Union Pacific sent a single General Electric U50 to tackle this climb, an assignment that had always demanded a trio of standard diesels. The train behind it was no lightweight. a loaded coal drag stretching over 100 cars and tipping the scales at more than 13,000 tons. Veteran engineers at the controls braced for the usual slow crawl, expecting to inch their way up the grade at barely 10 miles per hour. Instead, the U50 answered with a surge of power. Its twin 16-cylinder FDL engines combined for 5,000 horsepower, transferring every bit of it through 8 traction motors to the rails below. The locomotive dug in and kept the train moving at a steady 12 to 15 miles per hour, outpacing the 3-unit lash-ups that struggled to maintain momentum in the same spot. There was no need for extra helpers at the rear, no calls for backup halfway up the slope. One machine, one crew, and a mountain of Wyoming coal crested the summit together. The numbers from those early runs were hard to argue with. Where 3 1,750 horsepower units had once labored, the U50 matched or exceeded their performance on its own. Engineers reported the locomotive could start a 14,000-ton train from a standstill without slipping, thanks to its immense tractive effort of over 139,000 pounds force at low speed. Fuel consumption dropped too. With only one prime mover to manage, throttle settings stayed in the sweet spot, and the drag from redundant engines was gone. Maintenance planners took note. Fewer engines meant fewer breakdowns, and the shop could focus on one complex but powerful machine instead of 3 separate ones. Skeptics in the yard and the office watched closely as the U50 proved itself on Sherman Hill's unforgiving grades. Dispatchers tracked the data, noting how the single locomotive kept schedules tight and sidestepped the delays that came with multi-unit consists. For the first time, the economics of high horsepower had a real-world test case, and the results were impossible to ignore. On the steepest, most demanding route in the system, the U50 had done what its designers promised, replacing 3 conventional diesels, crew and all, with one weird machine that delivered under pressure. Trackside, the U50's size was not just a spectacle, it was a logistical headache. At 83.5 feet long, the locomotive dwarfed most shop bays and outgrew the standard turntables and roundhouses built for smaller engines. Maintenance foremen found themselves improvising. The span-bolstered truck design, with 4 distinct sets of wheels joined by heavy steel bolsters, meant the U50 needed more room just to enter a shop, let alone get lifted for repairs. Standard jacks and wheel lathes could not handle the weight or the unusual wheel spacing. Shops along the Union Pacific Main Line had to invest in custom lifting rigs and extend their pits, driving up costs and slowing routine work. Curves posed a different challenge. The U50's wheelbase, stretched by the B+B, B+B arrangement, limited it to main lines with broad, gentle turns. On older branch lines or in crowded yards, the locomotive's trucks struggled to follow tight curvature, sometimes binding or placing extra stress on the rails. Dispatchers had to plan carefully, routing the U50 away from sections of track where its length and stiffness risked derailment or damage. Engineers also learned to approach yard limits with caution, wary of the overhang that could clip switch stands or signals. Routine inspections took longer than expected. The dual engine setup meant twice the number of oil filters, fuel injectors, and cooling lines to check. Running diagnostics required technicians to move back and forth across the entire length of the frame, often needing ladders or scaffolding just to reach the far ends. Even simple jobs like swapping out traction motor brushes became all-day affairs. Spare parts inventories ballooned, since the U50's unique components were not shared with the rest of the fleet. For maintenance crews, the promise of a single, powerful locomotive came with a trade-off. Every gain in horsepower brought new complications in the shop. The U50 could conquer Sherman Hill, but only if the railroad was willing to retool its facilities and retrain its people. In the end, the hidden price of all that power was paid not just in dollars, but in time, effort, and a constant battle to keep the weird engine on the rails. Only 26 GE U50 locomotives ever left the assembly floor. For all its power and promise, the U50 remained a rare sight, confined to a handful of main lines and remembered mostly by those who worked alongside it. Union Pacific took delivery of 23 units between 1963 and 1965, while Southern Pacific accepted just 3. No other railroad placed an order. The reasons were as much about the direction of the industry as the machine itself. By the late 1960s, the economics of railroading were changing once again. The U50 had shown that one locomotive could do the work of 3, but its size, complexity, and special requirements proved too limiting for widespread use. Railroads began to favor a different approach: multiple unit operation. With advances in control technology, a single engineer could command several standard locomotives from one cab. This meant railroads could still harness massive horsepower when needed, but with far more flexibility. Crews could be reduced without the headaches that came with a single, outsized machine. The short production run of the U50 tells the story. After the initial batch, no follow-up orders came. Instead, manufacturers focused on developing more powerful single-engine models and refining multiple unit systems. The U50Cs that followed, 40 units built for Union Pacific, tried to address some of the original shortcomings, but new problems like wiring fires and frame cracks soon surfaced. Most U50s were retired by the late 1970s, scrapped for parts, or traded in for newer, more conventional diesels. Yet the U50 left a permanent legacy. It proved that railroads would try radical ideas if the numbers worked. Even as the industry moved on, the lesson endured. Innovation does not always mean mass adoption, but it can change the course of what comes next. The legacy of the U50 is measured not in production totals, but in its challenge to the status quo, a bold experiment that forced the industry to rethink what a locomotive could be. Innovation still faces resistance, especially when it breaks the mold. Today, railroads demand ever greater efficiency, and the need to challenge convention remains as urgent as ever. The U50 proved that radical solutions can work, even if they don't last. What counts is not how an idea looks, but whether it moves us forward. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments.